I'd like to introduce our speaker of the day, Colonel James Lawrence. He will give you his bio. He told me he would. Thank you and welcome him.
Good morning. What a pleasure it is to be here, and thanks to the Gadsden Patriots Association for inviting me, and it's an honor to stand close to the monument to Colonel Mize. What a great American, Medal of Honor winner, and it's just amazing that we're so close to his home and his heart. If you want to know what a hero really is, old Lee Mize was a hero. Having said that, one of the exciting things about having someone introduce you, they sometimes don't get everything exactly right. And I left the Army as a lieutenant, not a colonel. So I appreciate the promotion. And I met a colonel just a minute ago, and apparently we're equal now. So, Colonel, I'm looking forward to that, and wearing all the egg salad on my hat too. Let me tell you who I am very quickly, because we have, I know, a limited amount of time. I am Jim Lawrence. I am originally from Troy, Alabama, and you see standing before you an old man, a 74-year-old former cavalry trooper. But I want to take you back in time. I want to take you back to 1963. I want to tell you about a young man named, a 24-year-old young man named Don Cornett. Very quickly, when I graduated from military school in '63 and joined the military in '64, I reported to Fort Benning, Georgia, and the first person I met was my roommate in Infantry Officer Basic School, Second Lieutenant Donald Charles Cornett from Lake Charles, Louisiana. He was my roommate in Basic Officer Training School. He was my roommate in Paratrooper School. We jumped out of perfectly good airplanes, which still today doesn't make a lot of sense, but we did. Then he was my roommate on the USNS Maurice Rose going over to Vietnam. In age, we're 9 days apart. And I think the reason I'm telling you about him, because other than my father and my son, he's the best male friend I've ever had. When we were at Fort Benning, I was a bachelor officer. He was married to a beautiful woman named Sylvia. They had a beautiful son named Kevin, 18-month-old son named Kevin, when we left for Vietnam. And Sylvia was the kind of woman, she knew that as a bachelor officer, I was going to hamburger places every night. And so every Friday night, she would do meat and three. She would do a home-cooked meal and have me over to their married officers' quarters. And so I got to know Don and got to know Sylvia and got to know Kevin very, very well. Now, let me fast forward in time. In the spring of 1965, Lyndon Johnson goes on national television. He says, "I'm going to send a unit to Vietnam." We were at the time 2nd Infantry Division and 11th Air Assault Division, located at Fort Benning, Georgia. They converted those two units to the 1st Air Cavalry Division with the big yellow patch, the big yellow horse head patch. You'll see it on me. We'll shake hands later. We became the 1st Cav, and we were an experimental division. Our horses were helicopters, the Huey, the Chinook. But the Huey was our horse, and the Huey is what trained us to go into battle. We were the first full-sized American division to go to Vietnam. We got there in August of '65, immediately cut our base camp out of the jungle, and then fast forward now in time, let's go to November of 1965. Military intelligence said that the North Vietnamese were coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and infiltrating into South Vietnam. Their goal was to cut the country in half. Now you got to remember, in Vietnam there were two enemies. The Viet Cong was a South Vietnamese. By day, he might have been a farmer or a seamster or barber or something like that. But at night, they would put on their black pajamas and sneak into your base camp in groups of 2 and 3 with the goal of either blowing up a helicopter or cutting your throat or something like that while you slept. That was the VC, the Viet Cong. We called them Charlie. all right? But we hadn't met another group called PAVN, P-A-V-N, People's Army of Vietnam. These were trained North Vietnamese regulars. They were trained by Chinese communist advisors, like our Green Berets. They wore khaki uniforms, a big silver belt buckle with a red star. They wore pith helmets. They were armed with AK-47s. These guys were good. They were trained. They were tough. They were coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So our intelligence says they're crossing into Cambodia in the Pleiku province of Vietnam. So we, the 3rd Brigade of the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile, deployed into that area. Now, there were 2 units I'm going to talk about. One briefly, then I'll talk about the other in greater detail. The first unit, the first unit is 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry. 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, basically, is what they used to be called. That unit was under the command of Colonel Hal Moore. If that name rings a bell, if you've seen the movie We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson, that's who I'm talking about. 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry air assaults into a clearing called Landing Zone X-Ray, right at the foot of Chupong Mountain. That was on Sunday, November the 14th, 1965. For 2.5 days, the 1st of the 7th fought the North Vietnamese pouring off that mountain. They were outnumbered about 5 to 1. But because we had air superiority and because we had artillery and the North Vietnamese did not, we were able to maintain the battle and to win that battle, depending on how you define winning. We'll talk about that if we have a chance. So that's what happened. If you've seen the Mel Gibson movie, We Were Soldiers, it's a very accurate depiction of what went on Landing Zone X-Ray. Now, on Tuesday, November the 16th, 1st Battalion, 7th Cav lifts off. 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, that's my unit, goes into Landing Zone X-Ray. I spent the night on the ground. There were piles of bodies, North Vietnamese bodies. We had taken our own out. You could look up at the mountain and see campfires up there, so we knew the bad guys were still in the area. And then the next day, we got word to move away from the mountain because the B-52s from Guam were going to come in and bomb the mountain. And we were given orders to move about 3 miles to another clearing called Landing Zone X-Ray. When you're the air cavalry, you go from clearing to clearing in the middle of the jungles. You don't know what else is out there. We didn't know who else might have been out there. We hoped that the 1st Battalion had destroyed most of the enemy on Landing Zone X-Ray. So we moved overland to a clearing called Landing Zone Albany. This is a battle that the United States Army for a long, long time did not want to talk about because mistakes were made, and we moved toward that landing zone. I had just been promoted to 1st Lieutenant. I was Executive Officer of Delta Company. Don Cornett had just been promoted to 1st Lieutenant. He was Executive Officer of Charlie Company. We were moving towards that clearing. The Executive Officer, if you don't know, is the number 2 guy in a company. The captain is a company commander. The 1st Lieutenant is the Executive Officer. So Don Cornett and I were both 24-year-old 1st Lieutenants in charge of a company moving towards a clearing. What we didn't realize is that 2 fresh North Vietnamese regiments had just come across the Cambodian border and had made camp on the banks of a river called the Ai Drang. 2 units, the 33rd Regiment and the 66th Regiment. We walked right into them. We did not know they were there. They knew we were coming. They formed an L-shaped or a horseshoe-shaped ambush. When we walked into the ambush, they sprang the ambush. It's about 1:15 in the afternoon on Wednesday, November the 17th, 1965. My company, we've reached the landing zone. I can see a clearing about as far as from me to the sign up there that says the Falls entrance. That's about as far as it was. The men were told to take an administrative break. That was a mistake. They dropped their packs, took off their steel pots, lit cigarettes, opened cans of rations, leaned up against ant hills. And when I say ant hill, I'm talking about a mound about this tall, shaped like a little volcano that's as hard as this rock, hard as this podium. And the North Vietnamese have deployed all around us. It's 1:15 in the afternoon. Something felt strange for me. I didn't understand. And at about the same time, the colonel calls the captains forward to deploy the companies around the landing zone. So all the companies had been beheaded. The company commanders had gone forward. Who's number 2 in a company? The executive officer. That was me. That was Don Cornett. I was standing there. It just didn't feel right. It just didn't feel right. And about 1:15, way across the landing zone, the clearing, my old recon platoon, I'd been reconnaissance platoon leader before I'd been promoted. My old recon platoon came across something, and I heard a quick report from an automatic weapon. Turk! And I heard another quick report. Turk! And I thought, don't be shooting your weapons out here in the jungle. You're going to give our position away. At that moment, we had been paralleling a green wall. Now, not a man-made wall, a wall of jungle, of growth, of brush, of thorns, of briars, of trees. The trees had long, tall stalks, and they grew together at the top and formed a canopy. The North Vietnamese had deployed behind that wall, that green growth. And they were there. They were there waiting for us. They had climbed up into trees, and they were hiding in the canopies of the trees. And when the first weapons were fired, that meant that we had touched the base or the mouth of the ambush. They cut loose. All of a sudden, an absolute din of automatic weapons fire, machine gun fire, hand grenades, mortar rounds, just like a giant scythe came across the American column and just cut us to ribbons. It was unbelievable. If you've not been in combat, the noise itself is unbelievable. You can't hear, you can't think. It was total confusion. We weren't prepared for this. We didn't know they were there. We immediately go down, and we were in elephant grass about 2 to 3 feet high. And if you go down into a prone position with an M16 in elephant grass, you can see about as far as from me to the monument. So your line of vision is reduced. And I remember 2 things very distinctly: being on the ground, firing, and you could see them coming. They immediately, when they sprang the ambush, they came charging out of the hedge, because they understood that to defeat the Americans, they had to neutralize our air power and our artillery. Therefore, if they closed with the Americans, their tactic was called grab them.